Hi, everybody. I just want to do a sound check and make sure that you can hear me. If you could raise your hand on the GoToWebinar application. Great. Thanks. Thank you for joining us for Joint Ventures, a roadmap for small business government contractors. Before we start, I'll just briefly cover who we are at Virginia PTAC as a sponsored program of George Mason University. My name is Elizabeth Torrens, and I'm the operations manager of the Virginia Procurement Technical Assistance Center. We provide technical assistance and training to both small and large businesses about federal, state, and local government contracting topics. This Procurement Technical Assistance Center is funded in part through cooperative agreement with the Defense Logistics Agency. So at Virginia PTAC at GMU, we offer many free services to both small and large businesses, including training, one-on-one counseling, and conferences, events that we do. In addition to the free counseling that we offer our Virginia-based clients, we also have an inexpensive subscription bid match service available. More information about that can be found on our website if you are our client. Primary takeaway I want you to understand is that our events and training are free and open to anyone, regardless of whether you're a client, but the one-on-one counseling and bid match services are limited to our official clients, those Virginia-based government contractors in our region. If you understand that, then you can understand how to utilize our services. PTACs are regional or statewide, with over 94 of them nationally. You have a local PTAC near you who can offer one-on-one assistance. So if you'd like to find more information about that, you can go to aptac-us.org or go to our website and look at the locations page. There's a link to APTAC at the bottom, and you can find your local PTAC. And I'd also encourage you to look at our resources and links information and hopefully find some useful self-study there as well. Before we start today's webinar, I just want to go over some housekeeping. We'll make the slides available after the webinar. It's posted as a PDF on your eCenter where you signed up, and it's attached at the bottom of the event description. You won't be able to see it until I mark you as attended, but I will be taking attendance during the webinar. So by the end, we should be able to access it. But once you see that you've gotten a survey email, then you can click the link to take you to the eCenter, fill out the survey, and then just look for it under your training. There's also an auto login link in the reminder email I sent about a half hour ago. That'll take you straight there. Our instructors today at PilieroMazza requested to record the training for the later internal use, but they also kindly offered to distribute a copy of the recording to attendees of the webinar. Be on the lookout for an email after the class with that link, giving them a while to get it edited and posted. Regarding the Q&A, we're going to hold questions to the end, and if you can type them in the question section, not the chat box, then if we don't get to everyone's questions, please make sure there's enough context that our instructors can follow up afterward if needed, so that they can get those addressed if we don't get to them during class. We may end a little early today. Just the material probably won't take us to the full 90 minutes, so just wanted to let you know. Now that the housekeeping is done, I'd like to introduce Lauren Breyer and Anna Sullivan, attorneys in PilieroMazza's Government Contracts Group. Lauren represents commercial businesses in a variety of government contracting and litigation matters, and Anna works with the Government Contracts Group to help contractors maintain compliance with a myriad of laws and regulations governing federal contracting. Lauren, I'll let you go ahead and kick it off.
Okay, great. Well, we just wanted to say thank you for all those attending. And we're going to be covering, as Liz said, Joint Ventures, a roadmap for small business government contractors. And I think Liz gave enough background on myself and Anna, but I did want to provide just a little bit of background on PilieroMazza, our firm as a whole. So we are a business law firm, and we serve as a strategic partner for government contractors and commercial businesses across the U.S. We do have office locations in Boulder, Colorado, in Washington, D.C., where our main office is, and then as well as in Annapolis. And we cover really the gamut of issues relative to government contracts, including bid protests, claims and disputes, cybersecurity, data privacy, private equity and venture capital issues, labor and employment, and audits and investigations. Those are just a few things, but if it deals with government contracts, we likely have dealt with it before. So, excuse me, feel free to contact us with any questions outside of, joint venture issues that you may be dealing with as it relates to government contracting. So today, what we're going to be talking about at a high level is really how a joint venture is defined by the Small Business Act and SBA regulations, why a company would form a joint venture, and we're going to run through really the upsides for companies as to the benefits of forming a joint venture and doing business with the federal government, and then really the downside for companies. What are the negatives that may attach to a joint venture entity? Then we're going to be getting into how do you structure a joint venture, and then finally we'll be ending with how to comply with SBA regulations as they apply to joint venture entities, and then in closing, just some other considerations, just some high-level material that we think may be important as far as consistent issues that we face or that our clients face and bring to us to deal with. So that is really what we'll be covering today. So first off, what is a joint venture and really how is it defined? So what we're going to be focusing on today is what a joint venture is and how it's defined by the SBA. So the SBA believes that a joint venture is not an ongoing business entity, but rather something that is formed for a limited purpose and duration. If two or more business entities seek to join together through another entity on a continuing unlimited basis, then the SBA will view this as a separate business concern with each partner affiliated with each other. So under SBA rules, a specific joint venture entity generally may not be awarded contracts beyond a 2-year period. And we'll be getting into this 2-year period duration later in the presentation, but this is, again, just an overarching definition. That 2-year period starts from the date of the award of the first contract without the partners of the joint venture being deemed affiliated for the joint venture. So once a joint venture actually receives a contract, it may submit additional offers for this 2-year period from the date of that first award. And an individual joint venture may be awarded one or more contracts after that 2-year period, as long as it has submitted an offer, including price, prior to the end of that 2-year period. So it is important to understand that 2-year window. Again, we'll get into this in more detail, but as an overall definition, the whole point of forming a joint venture for the SBA purposes is that it is a very limited purpose. What we will not be talking about today is contract or teaming arrangements. So a joint venture in the context that we'll be discussing today is not a CTA. A CTA is an agreement between a prime and a subcontractor to perform on a specific contract as teaming partners. Again, this is representative of a standard prime contractor subcontractor relationship. We'll be using this relationship to distinguish the difference between a joint venture and a standard prime sub, and what the benefits and disadvantages may be as to moving towards a joint venture and not a CTA. But again, we're not going to be getting really into the weeds on what a CTA is and the benefits of that. That obviously would be a whole nother lengthy presentation. But I do think it's important to clarify that that is not what will be covered today, but there will be some distinguishing factors discussed today. The other thing that we are discussing when we reference a joint venture, we're not solely discussing mentor-protege relationships where you have a large business serving as a mentor to a small business who serves as a protege for the purpose of, using maybe a large business's past performance experience to, benefit your positioning as to getting an award by the Small Business Administration. We're also referring to joint ventures that are created by, multiple small businesses. Say you're a small business, but you're not an 8A. There's always going to be a benefit to that small business entity possibly joining a joint venture with for instance, an 8A set aside. They don't have that qualifying factor. So there's more than just the mentor-protege type of joint venture relationship. There also are, these different small business type relationships that can form joint ventures for a specific benefit, like an 8A set-aside contract. Okay, I think we can go to the next one. So why do companies joint venture? So the big reason why a company would engage in a joint venture is because the government can look to the resources of two or more companies to perform the work. So this question comes up very often. At our firm, we have various clients that, suddenly realize like, hey, joining a joint venture or creating a joint venture could be beneficial to us as we grow. Why do you think we should do it, or do you think we should do it? And what factors really come into play when discussing why or why not to form one? So this is, again, is the main reason, is this idea that they'll look to the resources of two or more companies. So say, for instance, you're a company that has heavy experience and past performance in a particular industry like IT. And you've been approached by another small business that has experience in a different industry like recruiting. And there's more of like a hybrid procurement that's been put out there that is intriguing to both entities. And you think, well, hey, if we pull together our resources, we're going to be able to meet particular specific RFP requirements and put ourselves at a really strong advantage to win this contract as a joint venture. But if we were to bid on this procurement alone, we only have this IT experience. We may have to bring in this recruiting experience through a subcontract. But we think that strategically we could put together a more winning proposal if we create a joint venture entity. So pooling resources, again, is normally the leading driving factor for forming a joint venture. Comparatively, if you decide, hey, we're just going to subcontract these recruiting services out, one of the detriments of doing that is when the government receives your bid, they're going to look at the offer and really focus in on the prime contractor, their past performance, and what they have to offer more heavily than they are going to look at the subcontractor. And the big reason for that is that the subcontractor is not in privity of contract with the government, and the government isn't going to be communicating directly with the subcontractor either. So it kind of breaks that communication off if you're going to be bringing, for instance, this recruiting company in to help you out on this contract, versus if you were to actually create an entity with them through a joint venture where you both are members in that JV and you can pull your resources together. Both entities have the opportunity to communicate directly with the government. That just brings, a huge benefit to you. One of the other benefits is that a minority joint venture member can exert more control over contract performance to protect its interests than in a traditional prime sub relationship. So when I say that they can exert more control, what I really mean is they have more of a negotiating position to their advantage as a minority member versus just being a lowly subcontractor. So what type of control they can exert is when they are engaging in the actual joint venture agreement. So when you're negotiating terms of the joint venture agreement, the minority member has more, positioning, negotiating stance than they would if they were just a subcontractor. And they have a stronger position also when they're negotiating the division of work share. And also, like I said before, they are in a better position as far as communicating with the government. Whereas when you're a subcontractor, you lose that leverage a little bit when you're negotiating just a CTA, a teaming agreement, because you lack that direct access to the government, and you lack that positioning as a minority venture by not creating a joint venture. So the other reason why you may want to engage in creating a joint venture is that it may allow the minority joint venture member to participate in a set-aside contract that it might not otherwise be eligible for. So I know that I previously said that we were going to be talking about, small businesses joining up with a different qualifying small business. for the purpose of getting a particular set-aside contract. So if you're, qualifying small business, but you're not an 8A, but you want to build up your past performance doing 8A type work, that is a great opportunity for you to join forces with another 8A small business through a joint venture, bid on an 8A set aside, get that type of work under your belt. Again, just to build your business as you move forward. And then finally, another reason why companies would create a joint venture, it allows the JV members to manage future growth and stay small longer, given how the SBA attributes the JV revenues and employees to JV members. So, hold on one second. So forming a joint venture is really a strategic way to keep your receipts in check. This goes to this final point as you grow a small business. So as a prime contractor working for the federal government, you have to book all of your receipts, regardless of how much work you get on a prime contract. So for example, if you're working on a construction project, you may only be performing, say, 15% of the work under the limitations of subcontracting. Again, this is something we'll go into more detail later in the presentation. But regardless, if you get a $10 million contract, as the prime contractor, you have to count the $10 million against your entity when determining your size for SBA purposes. If you create a joint venture entity, you have a little bit more flexibility as to how those receipts count against you under SBA rules. So SBA rules allow you as a joint venture to count less of receipts. So forming a joint venture is a really great way to work on larger projects without having that full amount of dollars count against your receipts, which in the long run allows you to stay small for size purposes for longer. So, if you have a low NAICS code size limit, this is a joint venture is a really good way to keep below that size standard. So for calculation of receipts, the appropriate proportionate share is the same percentage of receipts or employees as the joint venture partner's percentage share of the work performed. And again, I know that this can be kind of convoluted, but we'll be getting into the percentage share of work later in this presentation in more detail. But one thing that is good to keep in mind is that the SBA sets numerical definitions or size standards for every type of small business industry. So say you don't know what your size standard is, because the size standard is based on the number of employees and average annual receipts you receive. It's very easy to find on SBA's website. You just do a search of the small business industry, and you can really easily find the size standard. So it's the number of employees and average annual receipts calculation, and that's, again, readily available to you if you have questions about it, or you can reach out to us, and we're happy to help with those types of questions as well. Okay, so moving to what are the downsides to a joint venture. So on the flip side, I know that one of the benefits as a minority venture was that you have more of a say, you have more control over the formation of the entity itself as well as performance. Again, on the flip side, it can be an issue for a lead contractor because they're giving up more control to that minority venture. So again, as you're drafting the joint venture agreement or you're determining the work share division and the points of contact, some businesses that aren't used to joint venturing do have some issues releasing some of that control over to a minority member of the joint venture. So that's something to just take into consideration if you're thinking about jumping into a joint venture, that there are certain instances where that full control over performance is not going to be a fact. You're going to have to cede some control over to the minority venture if forming the joint venture. Another issue is that in some instances, the government may view the joint venture as lacking a clear point of contact. So this arises in cases where there's some confusion over who's actually in control. There's miscommunications between the joint venture itself, its members, as well as government points of contact, where the contracting officer suddenly isn't really sure who they are going to be dealing with. Issues pop up during performance and they're lacking certain cohesive communication from members. I like to call it too many cooks in the kitchen, and it leads to disagreements and some misunderstanding as to who actually has control, authority, or who is even to be held accountable for particular mistakes. So this is just a red flag to keep in mind when you are forming your joint venture agreement, to want to be very clear as to, who is the proper point of contact, who is going to be handling what on behalf of the government, and, how there are certain disputes that may arise, like how those are going to be handled, and to make sure it doesn't interfere with performance with the government. So that's another downside to just keep in mind. The other downside is that it's a longer, deeper commitment than just a traditional teaming arrangement. So I know that I previously said that the joint ventures are intended to last for a 2-year period. That's for as long as the joint venture can bid on contracts, but that doesn't mean that the joint venture doesn't remain in place for the period of performance of the contract that you, as a joint venture, are awarded. So in that 2-year period, for instance, you could be awarded an IDIQ that lasts 10 years. So the actual commitment to the joint venture can be much longer and deeper than a traditional teaming arrangement. And also then, you may think about when you're entering into the JV, you always want to be weary and understanding of, how long this joint venture could actually last. The other big discrepancy is, for a teaming arrangement, it's a little bit easier to withdraw or to terminate the agreement. Say you get into a dispute with a subcontractor, it's a little bit easier to get out of a teaming arrangement, replace the subcontractor, bring a new one in. There's particular dispute processes that are explained in teaming arrangements, and we use different ones, more steadfast ones in joint ventures, mostly because a joint venture actually has to be registered in SAM as its own business entity, and it also has to be registered in the state where it's doing business. So this isn't just a matter of, terminating a member. The joint venture itself actually has to be dissolved. This process, again, could be done in its own presentation. So dissolution is definitely more complicated than just doing away with a teaming arrangement. So another way to look at it is just less simple escape routes than a prime sub relationship if you're in a joint venture. The other thing too is that the joint venture is going to still be on the hook for continued performance, because if you think about it, the joint venture is still the prime contractor. So although, if you wanted to do away with your sub in a contract teaming arrangement, that's a little bit easier to just find a replacement. Whereas, if a member walks away from the joint venture, that makes things much more complicated as far as continuing performance as the prime, and how, you're going to manage expectations with the government moving forward. Another red flag just to keep in mind, and this is something that we bring up a lot to our clients when they come to us about executing a joint venture agreement, is that, it's extremely important that you vet your joint venture members before actually creating the joint venture. Again, people don't tend to really think long-term about these things, but you want to really make sure that you have that this long-standing relationship will last, and that you have proper protections in place in your joint venture agreement to make sure that, you're covered appropriately. And then finally, there can be some confusion over how work is supposed to be split amongst the ventures. So this kind of goes to a particular instance where, like, say, we'll go back to my example previously, where you're one member of the joint venture and your expertise is in IT. And again, the other joint venture's expertise is in recruiting. You guys were awarded a 10-year IDIQ, where task orders are being cut for IT and for recruiting. And all of a sudden, you're getting a lot of IT task orders. So you would think, hey, we'll funnel most of these task orders to the entity that has this experience. The other entity lacks this experience, so it makes sense for us to funnel most of the task orders to them. That can cause you a lot of issues. The reason for that is that there are work share requirements under the SBA. There's also the limitations on subcontracting, which we'll discuss later. But you have to adhere to these clauses if you're going to be creating a joint venture under SBA. And to remain eligible for particular work, you have to make sure that the work share is being divided appropriately. You can't just funnel particular task orders to certain members of the joint venture. So this can be a very critical issue, and we do have some clients that have come to us. They've already divvied up task orders this way, and they may be in violation of limitations on subcontracting, which can be a big concern. So it is very important that not only you know who you're going to be doing business with, but you adhere to the work share requirements as task orders are coming in or as work is coming in, and that it's split appropriately amongst the members of the joint venture as you have agreed upon in your arrangement and agreement for the entity. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Anna, and she's going to talk to you guys a little bit about these particular SBA regulations.
All right, hi everyone. So as mentioned previously, one of the benefits of a joint venture is that you have, the resources of two or more businesses to rely on, which is, from the business perspective, but also from the government's perspective, because, maybe the government wouldn't award the contract to a certain small business because they don't have the necessary experience, or the government has questions about their resources to form a contract. So those concerns can be partially or fully alleviated by a joint venture, because now the government can look to the resources and capabilities of both or all businesses, depending on the number of parties. But there is a fairly new rule that the government must take into consideration the past performance of all joint ventures on set-aside contracts, as well as any work done by the JV itself previously. In other circumstances, for other types of companies, the government will only generally consider the performance of that entity. There's some exceptions, but that's kind of the general rule. But for joint ventures, often the joint venture itself won't have any contracts at the onset, because it's multiple businesses coming together to form something new. So if the government could only look at the past performance of a joint venture, they probably wouldn't award many contracts to a joint venture because there's no past performance there. I mean, they might, but your chances are, much higher if you have a record of good past performance. So it's helpful to joint ventures that the government has to look at the past performance of all the joint venturers and not just the joint venture itself, because this helps to kind of bulk up the past performance that can be relied on. And as a follow-on to that, a procuring activity may not require the protege firm in a mentor-protege joint venture specifically to individually meet the same evaluation or responsibility criteria as that required of other offerors generally. So the government has to consider both or all members of the joint venture, not just the protege, to meet this criteria of the solicitation. So of course, the partners to the joint venture in the aggregate must demonstrate the past performance, experience, business systems, certifications, etc., necessary to perform the contract. And the joint venture can rely on the facility clearances of its members, but it's important to note that this is SBA's regulations, and the NISBOM does not necessarily agree with this, so there's a bit of a disconnect here to be aware of that has caused some confusion. And finally, SBA does not approve the joint venture agreements for any type of joint venture except sole source 8A awards. Previously, SBA would approve all joint venture agreements for 8A awards, but now it is just for sole source. So that means the onus is on the joint venture members to ensure that the joint venture agreement is solid, because SBA is not going to check on this unless and until it becomes a problem down the line. So you'll want to be sure that you have all your ducks in a row in case you are protested later, and so you aren't deemed ineligible or deemed to be affiliated with your joint venture partner. All right, so now I'm going to go on to some structural issues with joint ventures. There are certain issues, legally speaking, that you'll want to consider when forming a joint venture. So there's the legal form, it's a new company, that sort of thing. And then there's the quote unquote corporate forms. This doesn't necessarily mean paperwork you fill out. It means what type of entity you are forming. So whether it's a partnership, an LLC, corporation, any of these can be legitimate as joint venture. And there are some other considerations as well. So a joint venture can be populated or unpopulated. If the businesses forming the joint venture would like to remain unaffiliated, which most do, as a general rule, they need to have an unpopulated joint venture. This means that the joint venture itself does not have any employees. So all of the work is performed by the employees of the venturers. The exception to that would be administrative employees. Those can be counted and the joint venture can still be unpopulated. But populated joint ventures have their own employees performing the contract. And those will generally create affiliation amongst the venturers. So if you're wanting to avoid affiliation, then you don't want to have the joint venture hire employees on their own. Another consideration that Lauren talked about earlier is the limitations on subcontracting. So these are external performance of work requirements. So it's not about how much each venturer is doing, it's about how much the joint venture is subcontracting to other entities outside of the joint venture. So these other entities could be other joint ventures, other small businesses, a large business, etc. SBA regs and the FAR state that to comply with limitations on subcontracting, the small business needs to perform a certain percentage of the work. And this cannot be subcontracted past a certain percentage, which depends on the specific industry. And the limitations on subcontracting is just trying to prevent joint ventures from essentially acting as a pass-through entity that then just subcontracts out all of the work after bidding on a small business set aside. So you can subcontract out work to a quote similarly situated entity, which won't count against you for the limitations on subcontracting. And similarly situated is the same socioeconomic category as the set aside that you are going after with the JV. So suppose you're a woman-owned small business performing a women-owned small business set aside, you can subcontract out to another women-owned small business and it won't count against you for limitations on subcontracting purposes. All right. Further.
And Anna, sorry, let me just chime in quickly. When we talk about affiliation too, that feeds into the size standard that I was discussing earlier. So the benefit, for instance, of having an unpopulated joint venture is keeping your employee numbers low. So again, you can stay small for longer under SBA standards, size standards, if you're able to prevent a type of affiliation where there would be a combination of employee count and then also receipts. So that would be another benefit of maintaining an unpopulated joint venture.
Thanks, Lauren. Okay, so the next point is that the joint venture must be registered and active in SAM prior to proposal submission. So this is something that you'll just want to do pretty early on in the process because getting this registration active can potentially take a while. So it's best to just plan ahead on this and try to get it in with plenty of time to spare before proposals are due. And finally, the responsible manager, aka the individual person who's responsible for contract performance, cannot be an employee of the mentor and then become an employee of the protege. And this is for mentor-protege joint ventures specifically, but the regulations state that the responsible manager needs to be an employee of the managing venturer, which would be the protege because the protege is a small business. And you can't just shuffle employees here. So the managing venturer has to hire the person themselves. Okay, so joint ventures, of course, have to comply with all the regulations that we've been talking about so far. And they also have to comply with SBA's other regulations that also apply to the type of small business that has been formed. And all members must be small businesses under the NAICS size standard applicable to the procurement, unless the joint venture is with a large firm SBA or DoD approved mentor. So this is for mentor protege joint ventures. This is how large businesses can be in a joint venture for a small business set aside. And it's the only way that a large business can be a member of a joint venture and still go after a small business set aside. And I kind of already alluded to this, but the majority owners must qualify for the type of set aside that you're going after. So if you're going after an SDVOSB set aside, the majority owner must be an SDVOSB. And as discussed previously, the joint venture must be unpopulated, but you can have administrative personnel in the joint venture. And as Lauren talked about before, joint ventures are qualified for 2 years after the first award to the joint venture. It's important to know that novations are considered awards. So if you novate a contract from one business to another, this counts as an award. And previously, there were limits on the number of contracts a joint venture could be awarded in a 2-year period. It was the 3 and 2 rule. You could only get 3 awards in 2 years, but now there are no limits on the number of contracts that the joint venture can receive. And Lauren said this earlier, but the joint venture can, of course, continue to perform on these contracts past the 2-year mark. And it's important to remember that if the joint venture is, awarded an IDIQ, that future task orders do not count as additional contracts made after this 2-year mark. Okay, so we have the joint venture agreement and the operating agreement. Sometimes these are 2 separate things. This kind of depends on the SBA area office and what they want to see, but in most circumstances, you can make these the same document. You might want to check out what area office you'd be responding to in the event of a protest, just in case. But regardless, they'll be applying the same regulations to their analysis. That said, all of the components for the regulations, as stated in 13 CFR 125.8, must be included in the joint venture agreement for the JV to be compliant with the regulations. Of course, there are additional regulations for specific types of small businesses, so be sure to check those out as well. It is important to know that the joint venture agreement needs to be finalized and signed prior to the submission of the proposal. So this is another thing, along with your SAM registration, that you'll want to have finalized before proposals are submitted. And SBA is now comparing the joint venture agreement to the proposal during size protests. And if they don't match, then the joint venture might be rejected. So if your joint venture agreement says the JV was created for a certain solicitation and the proposal does not line up with this language, SBA might reject the joint venture as ineligible for award. SBA is really, cracking down on joint ventures, and the SBA's Office of Hearing and Appeals, or OHA, has recently ruled that the qualifying member must have control over if and when the joint venture submits a proposal, among some other issues. So you want to make sure you check all possible negative control issues. And not all of these negative control issues are in the regulations. And this is especially a problem for large primes and mentors who want to be able to control various functions of the joint venture. And negative control essentially means something that would give the partner venturer some kind of indirect ability to veto something that the joint venture does. And if you don't meet every requirement of the regulations, you might lose the contract if protested. So you'll want to be pretty careful right outside the gate when you're drafting this joint venture agreement. And the biggest reason for non-compliance that's been found in the case law from OHA is not itemizing major equipment, facilities, and other resources, or delineating the performance responsibilities of each party to the joint venture. So you want to be as specific as possible when you're delineating the performance responsibilities of the parties, which it might not be possible in an IDIQ to be like all that specific right off the bat, but at least provide, a framework as to the types of things that each partner will provide and how you'll determine who provides what down the line. Great, let's switch it back to Lauren.
All right, so I'm going to jump back in here and talk a little bit about joint venture compliance. And this is really touching upon some stuff that I discussed, and also some items that Anna ran through. Just as far as external and internal performance of work, what the difference is and how it's applicable to a joint venture. So I know that Anna touched on this as far as an external includes performance of work. So this ties directly to the limitations on subcontracting, which states that a joint venture must perform at least 15 to 25 to 50% of the work, for example, on the contract, which is measured by the dollars received from the government. The other percentage can be subcontracted to any firm. The reason why there's a spectrum of percentages here is because the percentage is applicable to what type of contract is being performed. So for instance, for services contracts, a joint venture cannot pay more than 50% of the amount paid by the government for performance to its subcontractors. And this can all be found on SBA's website, or we're also happy to answer any questions that you may have about, the applicable percentage to your contract. But again, for services contracts, for example, there's that 50% threshold. And then on the other side of the spectrum, for general construction contracts, the small business concern must not pay more than 85% of the amount paid by the government for contract performance. For construction contracts, so this excludes the cost of materials to similarly situated subcontractors. And then the internal performance of work, we like to term it, this goes to the qualified internal restrictions for the qualified members of JV and what they have to perform. So like Anna has said, the qualified member is the member that satisfies the small business category. So if you have created an 8A joint venture, the qualified member is the member that actually has that 8A approval, and that member has to perform at least 40% of the work that the JV is performing. Whereas if parties are in a prime sub relationship, the small business would have to be doing 51% of the work. This type of scenario is a little bit more beneficial, for instance, in a mentor-protege type arrangement. Say that, for instance, a small business is going to do 40% of the work, and the joint ventures decided that they're not going to subcontract anything else out. This would allow the mentor to do technically 60% of the work, whereas, if they were in a prime sub relationship and they were serving as a sub, they would only be able to be doing 49% of the work. So a lot of large businesses see this as an advantage in engaging in a mentor-protege type joint venture because it does allow them to control a little bit more of the work share. One of the things to note as far as internal performance of work, this cannot be met by subcontractors, even if the subcontractor is similarly situated. And I don't believe we've covered what that actually means, but it really is a first-tier sub that has the same small business program status. So if you're an 8A and you're subcontracting a percentage of work out to another 8A subcontractor, that is not going to go towards your internal performance of work calculations. The internal and external performance of work is determined period by period. It's not the full life of a contract. So that's also an important consideration as you're performing and keeping track of, work share requirements as well as limitations on subcontracting. You want to make sure that it's at a more granular detail than just, you're getting close to the end of the contract and you're going to start, taking numbers and seeing where your percentages are. That's not a good way to do business. You want to make sure that you're, checking in and calculating that you're meeting these requirements on a period by period basis. And then for IDIQ contracts, it's across all task orders per period of performance, the way that these calculations are made. But the FAR does allow contracting officers to write into their contracts that limitations on subcontracting as well as internal performance of work calculations must be met on an order by order basis. So this is heavily detailed, and it can be a strenuous requirement if it's written into your contract, because you say you're getting 100 task orders. If you have to keep track of these requirements and compliance throughout each task order, that can be daunting. So the one thing that we always like to warn our clients is that, you know, they're keeping an eye on their contract as well as their compliance as to whether or not the contracting officer wants this measured order by task order by task order, or if it's just across all task orders per period of performance. So again, it's really important to make sure you read your contract if you've received an award as a joint venture under an IDIQ, and you're making sure how best to comply with external and internal performance of work restrictions. So finally, JV work is calculated by adding work from all JV members combined. This includes work done by affiliates of JV members. So this type of calculation means it can be met by a similar situated qualifying member. So a good example here, and we actually had this issue for a client, if you say you're an Alaskan Native corporation and you have a sister company performing some work, even if they're not a member to the JV, so say they're actually performing some work as a subcontractor, this work actually would count towards work performed by the JV. This is a very particular context. So, you know, again, be wary of work that's being done by sister companies as well as subcontractors as far as affiliation goes. But that is one benefit. If you're, say, an ANC, you have a sister company helping you out, that this could go towards your 40% floor as you're performing on the contract. And then I'm going to hand the mic back to Anna to talk about some additional joint venture issues.
Okay, so we've discussed this throughout, but revenues for size purposes are calculated differently for joint ventures. This is based on work performed for revenue-based NAICS codes and on ownership for employee-based NAICS codes. So if you're the majority member in the joint venture and the joint venture performs 50% of the work and you performed 40% of that 50%, you would have to attribute to your books 40% of the total prime contract value. So the small business can grow and try to maintain their size status at the same time. Similarly for employees, but instead this is based on ownership. So the appropriate share is the same percentage of employees as the joint venture partner's percentage ownership share in the joint venture, after first subtracting any joint venture employee already accounted for in one of the partner's employee counts. So in a joint venture situation, you're never going to have to take on 100% of the receipts the joint venture receives like you would in a prime sub situation. And profits under SBA's regulations are split commensurate with the work performed, or the managing venturer can receive profits that exceed the percentage commensurate with the work performed, but it has to at least receive profits commensurate with the share of work performed. All right, so a couple of other issues to keep in mind. There are a lot of bigger government-wide vehicles that allow joint ventures to take advantage of all members' experience, past performance, and other qualifications, which can be really beneficial. However, performance of work calculations can be very difficult to do, especially with larger IDIQs. So if all of the work that you win ends up going to the non-qualified member of the joint venture, if you knew or you should have known that that would happen, there can be False Claims Act implications. So you'll want to try to comply as closely as you can with the performance of work rules, because the damages can be substantial here if you're found to have violated the False Claims Act. And other things to keep in mind on a case-by-case basis is to try and get creative when joint venturing, perhaps by, nesting a joint venture inside of another joint venture, which is permissible for now, or to form a joint venture with a large mentor and multiple proteges, or forming a joint venture with a large mentor, its protege, and another small business. So these are all ways to kind of push the envelope on what the regulations envision for, the spirit of the joint venture program. And there are ways to get, creative to put together the best team possible for a strategically aligned joint venture.
Sorry, I had put myself on mute. So I'm looking at the questions that were submitted, and I know that Liz said that I have a heart out. It looks like most of them are coming from one individual and then one other. And it looks like from Kelly Riley and Roberta Comer. If I'm saying that correctly, I apologize if I'm not. I think it would be best.
Okay.
Sorry, Liz, hold on one second. I think it would be best to just looking at Kelly's questions. They're very specific. Kelly, if you don't mind, I think it would be best to just shoot you an email just running through these various questions. If that's all right with you, I can just shoot you a follow-up at the close, just because I do have a heart out, and just one of these questions would take a lengthier amount of time to run through and provide a solid description. So I think it may be best to just take these offline, and I can follow up accordingly with our response if that's okay.
Sure. I mean, are there any, if you look at the questions that you've received so far, are there any that would be generally of interest to our
Sure.
attendees?
I think, well, for Kelly's first question, we can talk about that briefly because I did cover it, but basically for the for construction contracts with a 15% limitation, we talked about, hold on one second, that the small business concern must not pay more than 85% of the amount paid by the government to subcontractors. The 15% again is measured by dollars received from the government, but this excludes the cost of materials. So I know that she's asking, either way, is general condition, much of the cost can be based on labor, cost of goods sold, such as equipment, rental, fixtures, mechanical equipment, etc. We'd have to take a look at like what materials you're talking about. But again, it's calculated by the dollars received from the government. It's not going to be done by, I think you asked about labor. And then, yeah. Sorry, I'm just trying to see if there's one I can easily answer without.
Yeah, there were a couple of more questions.
There's just like pretty heavily detailed, and it's going to take me a little bit longer than the time I have available.
Sure. Well, if you wanted to send any follow-up notes to the wider attendee list, you think that it might benefit them to know, then feel free to send that after. And someone asked, do you have a checklist to form a JV that you can share? Items that a JV must do, such as getting SAM, Duns, Cage, etc. And if there's a specific order.
So that's a good question. So our joint venture head at the firm is Megan Lehman. So if you have any joint venture questions, those always get funneled through Megan at our firm. She leads that division. And I will ask her if she has just a standard checklist that we share. I mean, I know that we do have joint venture templates that we use as questions come in for various types of JV formations. But those templates do come with a cost, but we may have a more general checklist that we provide for free to just, the general public. I'm happy to follow up. And then as far as, again, these questions, they seem quite specific. If they provide more, or if we can provide a more general response, Anna and I for sure can distribute those to all attendees along with the recorded copy of this presentation. So we would be happy to do that.
That's great. Yeah, and I'll send you the list of everyone so you can send that email out when you've got it ready. And I will be sending a survey after we end here, everyone, so that just respond to that. And if you don't get the survey right away, give me an hour or two. And if you still don't see anything coming through, then you can shoot me an email if you attended, and I'll double check. But I should be reconciling the list here shortly to send out the follow-up email to everyone. Really appreciate your time and look forward to getting this list of very detailed questions over. Oh, and then one more question here. Does VA have specific requirements for SDVOSB JVs? Is that something that you can address?
So I actually, again, I don't deal with VA, SDVOSB agreements, but I can touch base with Megan Lehman and see if we can provide an answer on that.
Okay.
And I'll shoot that over today.
Okay, great. So if there's a follow-up email, it sounds like you're going to send that directly to the attendees. But if you have anything you'd like me to send out to everyone, do let me know.
Of course.
All right. Well, thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Anna. Really appreciate everyone's time today, and I look forward to the next PilieroMazza webinar. I think we have another one coming up. I'm just going to do a quick search to see when the next class is on the schedule. We have, oh, not till May. Okay, so we've got several in May, June, and one in July. So the next class we have coming up is mergers and acquisitions, innovations and recertification. That's May 3rd. And then limitations on subcontracting, updates and tips for compliance on June 7th. Those are the next couple. So we look forward to having your firm back and maybe you specifically. And then we got another question in that my company is a startup IT staffing and consulting agency. Therefore, joint ventures would be my only way of being able to obtain a contract of this nature. I look forward to the emails. Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks, ladies. And until next time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a good day.